Good morning. So good to see you. Real quick, another 30 for Freedom announcement. If you are a volunteer, scheduled to be a volunteer, signed up to be a volunteer, we have a meeting after service. So it won't be too long. We just want to go over some things, make sure we're all squared away for Saturday. And we have t-shirts for you. So there's, cookies from Crumble and t-shirts. Pretty good day. So if you could join us for that, that'd be great. Well, I am Pastor Jake, and it's good to be here and to see you all. I just love that we get to do this. Today, we are going back to our Philippians series, our Not Home Yet series. The past week has been, we just had a wonderful Easter service or weekend. I hope you enjoyed all of that. We heard a lot of just great feedback, especially from our Good Friday service. So we're just grateful that you enjoyed that. Now we're back to our Not Home Yet series. And our key verse is Philippians 3:20. It says, "But our citizenship is in heaven." For those of us who follow Jesus, we sometimes find it awkward or difficult to live here. How do I follow Jesus and do what he says and still live here? And the closer I get to Jesus, the more I get to know him, the more closely I follow his example, the more I have a hard time finding a match between what he says and what I see around me. There's these things that go without saying, these cultural norms in the U.S., the global West, and the world that don't seem to match up exactly with what he did and what he said. So how do I live? And if we're feeling that way, it's because this isn't home. Not really. And maybe it was home, but as we begin to follow him more closely, commit to that, we begin to feel a little bit more and more out of place. It's because we're from somewhere else. That is what is normal, and we're living in a place where it doesn't quite fit. It doesn't quite feel right. To me, an example that I thought of this week, we have a lot of students in our church, and I worked with college students for years, and I was a student. I went away from home. I lived in Michigan, went to college in Minneapolis, so I was 10 or 12 hours away from home. Many people do that, right? We leave home and we go to college, or we get a job somewhere, maybe go in the military, we do something, we leave home. And home, let's say home was pretty good. And you grew up and you felt great there. Like that was just how you do things, right? This is the way we are. We live this way. And then you move away and you start doing some things differently. And maybe that's good too. You just adopt some different kind of, ways of eating, ways of talking, different kinds of entertainment, whatever it might be. Different interests that don't match up with the interests that were kind of normal in your home, and then you go. This worship service. Thank you for this chance to come together. I pray that you'd speak through me. Lord, I pray that you would help us to follow you more closely. Help us to understand you better, Lord. Help us to live here in a way that pleases you, that resembles you, that reflects you, and draws more people to you. So I give you this time in your holy name. Amen. So that's what we're talking about. And we're going to be in Philippians. Last time I talked, we were in Philippians a couple weeks ago. I covered a whopping 3 verses. Today we're going to cover 15, so it's going to be a big day. So brace yourselves, but it won't be extra long. I think that it was 3 chunks. I think they all kind of fit together pretty nicely, so we're going to cover those and finish chapter 1 today. So verses 15 through 18. So let me bring you up to speed. Last week we talked about Paul's in prison. Remember this, or 2 weeks ago? Paul's in prison, and while he's in prison, he refers to it as that thing that happened. He's in prison for preaching the gospel, and he's writing. Did I just lose me? Are we good? Okay, sorry. I just don't touch my face. So he's in prison, and he's rejoicing that he's in prison, because while he's in prison, he's getting to share the gospel. He's in prison for sharing the gospel, and you'd think you'd kind of button it up a little bit. He doesn't. Instead, he shares the gospel with who? His oppressors, the Roman guard, like the last people, the people that are imprisoning him. He's saying, hey, let me share this great news with you, this thing that you need to know, this great secret. Let me tell you about this. And he tells the Roman guard this, and then he tells his other prisoners. And so he's excited. Like these people that he probably wouldn't have been able to speak with otherwise, he now gets to share the gospel with. And then we don't know where he's in prison. Traditionally, we say Rome. But he's in prison somewhere, and he's writing back to the Philippians about what's going on. And he says, hey, not only am I getting to share the gospel, but many of the other brothers and sisters are encouraged by what they're seeing, and they're sharing the gospel too. You think about that. Like their leader is in prison for doing this very thing, and they might say, hey, I got mouths to feed, bills to pay. Like I'm just going to wait. Let's see if this blows over, because I don't want to go to prison too. Fair enough. Who wants to go to prison? Right? And so instead, they're encouraged and they're sharing the gospel. So Paul's like, hey, great things are happening. He's in prison. He's really in prison. And yeah, he's excited about it. So now he's going to continue on. So all these people are out there preaching the gospel. Now we get to verse 15. Some indeed preach Christ from envy and rivalry, but others from goodwill. The latter do it out of love, knowing that I am put here for the defense of the gospel. The former proclaim Christ out of selfish ambition, not sincerely, but thinking to afflict me in my imprisonment. What then? Only that in every way, whether in pretense or in truth, Christ is proclaimed, and in that I rejoice. So Paul's in prison, and many people are inspired to preach the gospel, and some are doing it out of love and gratefulness. Others are using the opportunity to preach the gospel and trash talk Paul. That's what's going on. And now there's a couple different kinds of preachers that Paul will write about. And one is we're going to talk about in chapter 3. He talks about a lot in Galatians, other places. Is there's a group of preachers that sometimes followed him around as he would plant a church, preach Jesus, preach grace. He would leave, and then they would come behind him, and he called them the Judaizers. And what they were doing, and the early church really struggled with, we're Jews. Jesus was a Jew. How Jewish are we? Like, what do we do with this? Like, things have changed because of Jesus. But what does that mean? What do we do? How much of our Judaism do we continue? Do we maintain? And how much do we leave behind? And what does it look like? They're trying to figure this out. And there's division and disagreement and debate and struggle with this. Some of them were using that as an opportunity to preach a gospel that was not a gospel. It wasn't freedom. It was very oppressive. And Paul has very strong words about them. He says things like, I wish they would emasculate themselves, which is exactly what it sounds like, right? Like he's angry about this. That's one group of preachers. We're going to talk about them in chapter 3. Now he's talking about a group of people that's different. They're preaching the gospel. And yet, for some reason, they're taking this as an opportunity to trash talk Paul. And we don't know anything about them. We don't know their names or where they're from. We don't even know where he's at. But he's saying, look, some of them are preaching Christ out of selfish ambition. Some are preaching out of love. Paul says, Christ is proclaimed, and in that I rejoice. Remember, we just celebrated Easter, right? And the crucifixion, the death and resurrection of Jesus is God epitomized. This is the prime example. This is your main example of who Jesus is. This is what he came to do. His whole life was building up to that moment. That was the redemptive and restorative moment. So if you want to know Jesus, and Jesus says, if you want to know the Father, watch me. If you want to know the Father, look at what Jesus did. And it starts with the cross. It starts with the cross. And what happened on the cross? Jesus died at the hands of his enemies. And while he's on the cross, he says crazy things like, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing. They don't understand any of this stuff. They think they do, but they don't understand. Father, forgive them. Those people that have whipped me, stoned me, jeered at me, put a bloody crown of thorns on my head, have mocked me, stripped me, and hung me up here naked, forgive them. That's when we're trying to figure out what to do and how to be, that's where we should start. In response, how do I act in response to that? That's a pretty heavy thing, right? That should cause some meditation, some reflection. What does that mean? Christ died at the hands of his enemies. That's my prime example. Paul says Jesus is being preached. So the message is fine. They're not preaching some weird gospel, some weird doctrine. They're not distracting people from who Jesus is. So message, check, we're good. The method, Paul believed in preaching. Paul even says, I'm not that great of a preacher. And they're preaching. He believes in preaching. That's a great way to communicate this message. Of course I would say that because it's what I'm doing this very moment. But the method, we talk about that a lot. We watch services of churches on TV, and we're like, hey, they're doing things with the gospel I don't know if I agree with, and their method, it's this or that. I'm not sure how I feel about that. Paul says the method's fine. They're preaching Jesus. The only thing that's in question is their motives. And if you're wondering where I got the 3 M's, message, method, and motive, I stole that from a commentary. That is not me. I can't come up with that stuff. So he says, leave the motive, the judgment of that to God. I'm going to rejoice that people are hearing about Jesus. Now, again, Paul is emotional. In a lot of his letters, you get these strong emotional reactions to things. He's passionate. So if he's feeling peaceful about this, he's not just withholding, right? He tells us what he thinks. And Paul's no saint. He gave us a lot. God gave us a lot through Paul, but he's no saint. He's just a man. But here he's saying, Jesus is being preached, so that's what I'm here for. So great. I'm not going to worry about it. Philippians 1:2, the first message in this series, we talked about his greeting. We covered, I think, 2 verses that week. He says, the typical greeting for Paul includes his name, maybe who he's writing to, and then he says, grace to you and peace from God our Father and the Lord Jesus Christ. Grace to you and peace. And that grace to you and peace is significant. We all want some kind of peace, right? We want peace in our families. We want peace in Ukraine. Peace with our own self-identity, right? Peace with maybe our unfulfilled dreams. We want peace in our relationships. We want peace. So that doesn't come without grace. We can find ways to get some version of peace, and we touch it for sure. We eat better. We have better habits. We make better choices. We try to be more forgiving, more kind. We feel more peace. But there's some turmoil that still rumbles, right? It's still there. We're still broken. Paul's saying, look, grace to you first. The grace of Jesus Christ, the grace that was revealed on the cross to you, and then peace. The peace you want, you won't get until you first experience this grace. So Paul's in prison for preaching the gospel, and the brothers and sisters, some of them have his back. They're encouraging him. They're visiting him. They're preaching the gospel. He's excited because they're motivated. They're on the same page. And others are using this as an opportunity to steal some of his fame and claim it for themselves. And his attitude is, don't worry about it. Don't worry about it. Grace to you and peace. I have peace because of the grace I have in Jesus. If you've ever had someone steal something from you, your ideas, whatever, and push you down in some way, it's hard to feel peaceful in that moment, right? It's hard. I used to work at a place, and so often I would share an idea and it would get shot down only to get repeated by someone else, and then it would be acceptable, right? That would be a great idea. I'm like, what's the deal? It's hard to feel peaceful in that moment about really anyone in that space. The peace comes from the grace. Grace to you and peace. I think of John the Baptist. John the Baptist's whole life was about Jesus, paving the way for Jesus. The story goes that while in the womb, Mary comes to visit Elizabeth and John leaps, right? He recognizes that the Messiah is near. It's one of all the trippy things in the Bible. That's up there, right? Like, what? Did that really happen? That's crazy. John knew from the very beginning what he was here to do, and he lived his whole life to fulfill that single purpose. And he knew who Jesus was, and yet Jesus wasn't what anyone was expecting. And John was like, he ate bugs and honey, and was weird. And he's baptizing people, which wasn't really common. It wasn't like this normal thing throughout the history of Judaism to do this, but he's leading people into repentance, a new, a deeper, more sincere, full relationship with God. All that anticipating and paving the way for Jesus. And then Jesus' ministry starts, and they kind of coincide for a while. And then at some point he begins to wonder, is Jesus the Messiah? Is he just want to confirm, right? Is this guy the guy that I've been waiting for? And once he knows that, he says, he must increase, but I must decrease. I see that attitude in Paul. Hey, this isn't about me. This is about Jesus. So if Jesus is being preached, don't worry about it. Or to quote Nolan, don't worry about it, nerd. Right? Don't worry about it. This is a weird kingdom perspective. This is not a perspective that we have normally here, right? Here, it's about me. How can I promote me? How can I establish me? How can I get the fame and the credit I deserve? But for a citizen from heaven, the priority is not me. The priority is, are people hearing about Jesus either through my words or through my actions, the way I treat others? Is Jesus being proclaimed? Is Jesus being made known because of through me and through my life or not? That's the priority. So someone steals an idea in a meeting, that's not great, but how I act or how I react to that moment could promote or distract from the gospel, right? There's a couple soccer coaches in the room, and all of us who have coached any game, or if you're a sports fan, you have these moments where you're like, I don't know how to act. This ref needs my help, right? Or this other coach, or these fans, or something. The world needs my help. I have so much to offer. I coach at La Crescent High School, and there have been many, many moments over the past 3 seasons where I'm like, I'm here to plant a church. I'm here to plant a church. Like, I'm here to plant a church. Like, that's why I'm here. And so, I'm like bleeding and doing my best to keep things under control. You got to keep the right perspective. What's the most important thing? Keep the main thing. For a citizen from heaven, the main thing, there are other important things, but the main thing is Jesus being preached? Is Jesus being shared? Is Jesus being promoted? Are people hearing about Jesus through me or not? If it's the opposite, then my priorities are probably out of whack. Moving on to verse 19 through 26. So he begins that last passage, I will rejoice. Yes, and I will rejoice, for I know that through your prayers and the help of the Spirit of Jesus Christ, this will turn out for my deliverance. As it is my eager expectation and hope that I will not be at all ashamed, but that with full courage now, as always, Christ will be honored in my body, whether by life or by death. For to me, to live is Christ, and to die is gain. If I am to live in the flesh, that means fruitful labor for me. Yet which I shall choose, I cannot tell. I am hard-pressed between the two. My desire is to depart and be with Christ, for that is far better. but to remain in the flesh is more necessary on your account. Convinced of this, I know that I will remain and continue with you all for your progress and joy in the faith, so that in me you may have ample cause to glory in Christ Jesus because of my coming to you again. So remember, Paul loves this church. This is one of the nicest letters in the New Testament. Other churches, there's issues, and Paul kind of goes at it pretty hard. Paul, he's just excited about the Philippian church, and he's writing this letter mostly to encourage them. But he's in this place of surrender and confidence and total freedom. He can't lose. Whether he lives and continues to do his work or dies and goes to heaven, he wins. Right? The odds are in his favor. No matter what happens, he wins. Many of you, it's my first beer commercial I think I've ever referenced in a sermon. Dos Equis? There's the most interesting man in the world. Once gave a pregame speech. It was, I think, a soccer game. Once gave a pregame speech so inspiring both teams won. Right? He can't lose. He cannot lose. He wins no matter what. He gets to continue his ministry, continue sharing Jesus, and hopefully go back to Philippi and hang out with his friends there. The people that, remember, he planted this church in an entirely Roman city, almost no Jewish base. Started with his first convert was Lydia. Right? And then he grows this church, and he grows it because of their work. It wasn't just him. And then he's able to set it, give it to them, and then continue his ministry. And he's so excited about what they're doing. If I live, I get to go back and work with you and spend some time with you and keep doing what I'm doing. But if I don't, I get to be with Jesus. I win no matter what. And remember, for him, the transition, if he is to go home and be with Jesus, it's probably going to be brutal. It's not just like yes or no. I get to stay or, I'm gone. It's prison and then maybe crucifixion. One of the things we have to recognize about the apostles and Paul, most of them were martyred, many of whom died terrible, awful deaths. Crucifixion, boiled, you name it. They did what they did because they fully believed. And Jesus wasn't what they expected. So the idea that this gospel is made up is kind of crazy because this is not what anyone would make up. There's too many stories in the Bible. If I'm trying to trick you, I would not write the Old Testament this way. Because the Old Testament makes the Jewish people look pretty bad. The whole thing. They just couldn't get it. Which is great because neither can I, right? I'm always screwing up, and so are thee, and yet the story is one of grace. If I wanted to write a story to trick you, it would make the people of God look much better than the Bible makes them look. It would make the gospel much easier to believe and much more in line with what they were expecting. They weren't expecting Jesus to resurrect, and then he did. So what's going on now? We didn't think he died, and now he's resurrected. What's going on? This is all new to them, and they died for it. And they died brutal deaths. So when Paul says, I win whether I live or die, this dying option is a bloody option, and yet it gets him from here to there. So he's like, hey, this we're just in a short line segment. It's part of a longer eternal line. I can get through this to get there. Either way, I win. What or who does he defeat? Death. Death itself is defeated. That's what Christ accomplished when he died on Good Friday. He defeated death. And he took the sting out of it. It's still death, but there's something lost. It's not as awful as it could be. It still hurts when we lose someone, for sure. But the sting is gone. The permanent sting is gone because it's colored by hope and faith and grace in something beyond this. It isn't an end to itself. It brings its own reward. Paul says, that might be rough, but what comes after, I'm good, right? I win. No matter what happens, I win. Either way, live or die, Paul's life is full of purpose. A purpose that surpasses his present circumstance. Back to verse 21. For me to live is Christ. To die is gain. we have to recognize that many of us struggle with kind of the way this country is going. And we talk about persecution, losing religious freedoms. One, we have to recognize that persecution of Christians is the normative state historically and globally for Christians. Because we live in the West, we don't think of it that way because we're pretty ethnocentric. Everyone is. It's just kind of the way that we are, but pretty ethnocentric. We have to recognize that there is much of the world east of Rome with lots and lots of people where it's very difficult to be a Christian, very dangerous. Persecution, martyrdom still rampant, day-to-day basis. That's normative for the global history of Christianity. And we could say, well, we're losing some freedoms here, we're being persecuted here. I would counter with saying this building is owned by the City of the Cross, and we're not in secret. So are some things changing? Sure. But is this persecution? No. That doesn't mean that it can't be difficult to share your faith. We are living in the post-Christian global West. The Christian centers are now southern hemisphere, South America and Africa. It used to be Europe and America. We're sending missionaries everywhere, and we still do that, but we are not far from getting lots of missionaries from the global South because we're in need of more help, at least in terms of sharing the gospel, than they are. Paul says, to live is Christ, to die is gain. This is a radically different perspective, isn't it? We're so obsessed with staying alive and staying young and enjoying getting everything we can out of life, which usually involves collecting as many things that we don't need, right? But to have them. What if I live like this? Like to live is Christ, to die is gain. Either way, I win. What if I live with Jesus' concerns as a driving force in my day-to-day? And with the full confidence that no matter what happens, it will be good. It's going to be good. Hard? Sure. But good? Absolutely. Verse 27 through 30. Only let your manner of life be worthy of the gospel of Christ, so that whether I come and see you or am absent, I may hear of you that you are standing firm in one spirit, with one mind, striving side by side for the faith of the gospel, and not frightened in anything by your opponents. This is a clear sign to them of their destruction, but of your salvation, and that from God. For it has been granted to you that for the sake of Christ you should not only believe in him, but also suffer for his sake, engaged in the same conflict that you saw that I had, and now hear that I still have. He is saying, look, this is going to be tough. There are tough times ahead, but that is an opportunity for Christ to reveal himself to the very people who are struggling with you, pushing against you, in Paul's case, imprisoning you. But it begins with, only let your manner of life be worthy of the gospel of Christ. Now, some of you, when we read this, and I will confess, when I first read that line, I go straight to a bunch of behaviors. And to be fair, to be true, there are behaviors or non-behaviors, I guess, things that Christians do and Christians don't do. Many of us went to something like, don't smoke, drink, or chew, or run with boys and girls who do, right? We went to something like that. Let your manner of life be worthy of the gospel of Christ. I was we were talking this week about, you older folks, there's a few of us in here, remember the satanic panic of the 80s, right? And everyone's obsessed with Satanism. It was so weird. What a weird life, right? And I don't know how many CDs and tapes I burned. There's all this stuff. We burn this stuff because we've got to have this manner of life worthy of Christ. But where does Paul go, at least in this passage? He goes to unity. Striving side by side. We're going to talk about that multiple times throughout this series. Unity is so important. So while there may be some things that we need to stop doing and some things that we start doing, these Christian kind of behaviors, for Paul, at this moment, he's saying, look, if you want to make it through all that's coming, the challenges that are coming, you got to stick together. That while this is an individual faith, this is also a we faith. This is a us. This is a y'all. And there, you've heard me say this before, there have been times when in my life, I don't know if I would have made it. I would have remained faithful to Christ if it weren't for my family or my church back home or friends. College, I went through a very dark time. Very dark time. I was a student leader at a Bible college. So student leaders were kind of a big deal. And I was like, I don't think I believe this stuff. I think I'm done. And a friend of mine walked me through and got me back. Helped me understand some things, see some things that I wasn't seeing. Did he indoctrinate me? No. Did he trick me? No. He loved me. And he helped me. We get through this together. Sometimes I'm strong when you're feeling weak, and I can lend you some of my strength. Sometimes you're strong when I'm feeling weak, and you can lend me some of your strength. Sometimes I'm feeling down and depressed and hopeless, and you can lend me some of your joy. Right? We get through this together. So when you only let your manner, read only let y'all's manner of life. And part of how we are going to share the gospel and remain faithful is leaning in to each other. Unity. And I'm not saying unity at the expense of justice. Right? 30 for Freedom is about justice now. This isn't about just wait and let things take care of themselves. There are moments when we intercede and we inject ourselves for justice sake. The Bible is very clear about that. God is very concerned for the down and out, for the oppressed. And as confusing as the Bible can be, it's not the passages about justice and our role in justice are really not that confusing. God cares deeply, and he expects his people to partner with him in justice work. So there will be injustices that we need to confront. And there will be problems, heaven forbid, but if there's a problem in this church at some point, we're going to deal with it. We're not going to sweep it under the cover. This isn't unity for unity's sake at all expense, for sure. There's enough organizations where you can see they screwed up. They didn't deal with problems and people got hurt over and over again, and they failed at that. But unity is so key. We need to stay together. We need to interact, love one another. That means sometimes confronting things. That means sometimes just being graceful with one another. It means being present, being faithful. And the hard part is we're all fallen, so we all need each other to absorb our fallenness on some level, and yet we do it in a fallen way. So I'm not the only John Piper quote I know, he's a pastor in the Twin Cities, is the church is a mess. It's always been a mess, but we're working on it, right? Because it's full of people like you and me, right? So of course there's going to be goofy things, sad things, unfortunate things, but we press in, we keep working on it. Worship team, you can come up. Our citizenship is in heaven. This side of heaven, things can get a little confusing. So what are we to do? What are we to think? What are we to feel? How are we to act? Keep our priorities straight and Christ-centered. And to sum up, don't worry about it. God's going to keep working through your circumstances. That thing that happens, whether it's prison, some kind of pain, some kind of betrayal, if we turn that over to God, he will work through it and in it. And this line segment, though painful and difficult, is full of purpose and value and meaning and grace and hope. And we trust that God is working things out. This isn't a passive thing. I'm just going to sit here. I'm just going to do nothing. This is an active thing. No matter who we are, no matter what our job is, our intelligence, our IQ, our talent, level of talents, the number of talents we all have purpose. And that purpose is letting God work through us to show himself to the people around us, to show this grace and this peace to the people around us. So we trust God. We say, God, I'm going to try to remain Christ-centered. You died on the cross at the hands of your enemies, and that is the most important thing that ever happened. I want that to be my number one moral standpoint, ethical standpoint. This is the guiding light. This is the number one priority. And I'm going to trust that you're going to keep working no matter what's going on. I'm going to trust that you're using anything. You can use anything. You will use anything to glorify yourself and give purpose to that pain. And we stand firm together. We lean on each other for strength and courage because we are necessary for us to make it. Lord, I thank you for your word. I thank you for the example of the Philippians and of Paul. People who went through difficulty just like we are. People were confused. They didn't know always how to live. What's expected of me? What's the right thing to do? Just like we are. We don't always know. Lord, I pray that you continue to work in our hearts. Help us to know you better, to follow you more closely. But help us to live in these realities, that you are faithful and you are present, that you did indeed die, and that you did indeed rise again, and you have a plan that you want to work out through us and with us, Lord. I pray that you would help us just to trust in that and to encourage one another in that. We give our lives to you, Lord. Amen.